Carl and I met young, and we were both full of plans and hungry to prove ourselves. We used to talk for hours about the things we'd do. Hello, everyone from the outside. My life was enviable. My friends and family saw a woman with a successful career, a charming home, and a husband who had once been the love of her life. But sometimes looking perfect on paper only made the gaps feel wider and the loneliness sharper. Still, every morning I woke up feeling like I was drifting through a life that wasn't truly mine. The life we'd create. But as the years passed and our goals became more specific, he took a job for stability. It was meant to be temporary, but it ended up defining the next 10 years, and gradually he became content with less. I tried not to be angry. I wanted to help him and be thankful for the stable, quiet life we created, but it wasn't enough. At first, I couldn't identify what was lacking. Perhaps it was that Carl stopped noticing the small details about me, or perhaps we both drifted too far away to find. Our journey back was filled with long silences, filled with the sounds of sitcoms and reality shows I didn't enjoy. I would sit across the room pretending to read as I felt our shared space grow colder and empty. Night after night, I kept my complaints to myself, dismissing them as normal marital frustrations, hoping they would go away, but every time I brought up even the smallest thing, the fact that he hadn't noticed my new haircut or that we hadn't taken a vacation, he would get tired and settle in front of the TV. It was the one place where I felt like myself again. I was good at what I did, respected, even admired, in control, confident, and surrounded by people who shared my energy. I think it was that need to be seen, to be valued, that initially drew me to the new associate Ben. Ben was magnetic, quick-witted, and Carl would shrug and say something about how life was busy, and I was overthinking it. After a while, I stopped mentioning those things altogether because I couldn't stand the feeling that I was asking for too much work. The first time he truly complimented me, we were leaving a late meeting with everyone else already half out the door, and Ben lingered nodding at my ideas and asking me questions. He said he could tell I had a sharp mind and that I was the kind of person who made things happen. I didn't seek him out, but he seemed to naturally end up beside me during meetings and coffee breaks, always flashing me that playful, easy grin that made everyone feel like they were the only ones in the room. Simple, but they stayed with me. It had been a long time since someone had treated me that way, as if I mattered more than my position or title. I began to notice him more, and I would catch myself laughing a little too much at his jokes, hanging around the coffee maker a little longer in the hopes that he would join me there. Every time we spoke, I felt the same excitement I had experienced years ago with Carl, but I knew better than to let it show that it was all harmless because it was just friendly conversations with a younger colleague, or at least that's what I thought. The office was buzzing with energy that reminded me of the person I thought I'd left behind. Ben would catch my eye across the conference room, and a glint in his gaze felt like a secret. It was harmless, I told myself, just something that made the day a little less mundane at home. This was what I kept telling myself after those first few conversations with Ben. I didn't want to admit it, but something changed, and I started looking forward to work in a way I hadn't in years. Unaltered, unbroken, Carl had recently taken on more hours, and his entire focus was now on paying bills, repairing leaks, or saving for a new roof. There was no passion or urgency between us, just the routine checklists and the kind of comfort that felt like settling. When we first started dating, he had always encouraged me to dream bigger and work harder, telling me that I could accomplish anything. Now, though, it felt like I was too much for him, and my goals only tired him when I told him about a project I'd been working on. Carl was invited to a promotion party for one of our team leads one Friday night, but I knew he would find a way to avoid going, because parties weren't his thing. He would always tell me to go have fun, that he'd rather stay home and catch up on a show, so I didn't even ask him this time. Instead, I got ready in my office, freshening up my makeup and changing into a dress I brought from home. He nodded, then picked up his phone and checked his emails as if I had stopped talking. Ben was the life of the party. He had a natural way of making everyone feel like they belonged, like they were part of some inside joke that only he knew, and he didn't just charm the higher-ups. He mingled with everyone, laughing, and filling the room with this energy that drew me in. We gravitated towards each other as usual, but tonight felt different. The tension between us was almost Ben leaned in close, his face inches from mine, and I was laughing at a joke he had made about our boss's lack of tech skills when his eyes caught mine and held them. His expression changed ever so slightly, and his voice softened as he said, "I don't think I've seen you look this happy in a long time. It suits you." I could feel the electric energy in every sideways glance and every touch as we passed around drinks and toasted promotions. However, in a way that could still be dismissed as innocent, I told myself that it was the excitement of the evening and the champagne that looked in his eye that made me feel young and interesting. Later, when I looked into the ladies' room mirror, I hardly recognized the person staring back at me. My cheeks were flushed, my eyes were bright, and I was glowing in a way I hadn't been in years. On Monday, things at work returned to normal, but Ben and I slipped back into our routines, exchanging our customary smiles and casual comments. But there was an unspoken understanding between us. Now felt like we were both acting as if Friday hadn't happened, as if that night hadn't ignited a spark that now permeated every casual encounter. It was innocent, but it was also the most exciting thing I'd experienced in a long time. I began staying late at work more frequently, picking projects that needed his assistance as small justifications to keep us together after everyone else had left for home. Carl didn't notice any of it, and his only concern was whether or not the late nights weren't wearing me out. Provided him with some evasive justification about significant deadlines, and he appeared content. It was ironic to me that he was concerned about my work ethic, but never about who I was working with. A detachment in his inquiries, and the ease with which he accepted my responses only served to emphasize how far apart we had drifted. As the weeks passed, Ben and I became closer in ways that were both exciting, and I told him about my own dreams, the ones I buried, and the things Carl and I had planned but never had. With every conversation, he seemed to understand me a little better, and I started to crave that understanding and attention. Then, one night when we were working late, he asked how Carl felt about all these extra hours you're working. It was risky, but we started sharing stories about our lives that went beyond the superficial office chatter. I was surprised when he asked the question, so I laughed it off and said he didn't mind as long as I was happy. However, Ben didn't smile. Instead, he gave me a knowing look and asked, "Is that enough for you?" The question lingered in the air, piercing the silence of the empty office. It was the question I had been avoiding for a long time, and for a moment, I didn't even dare to ask myself because I felt as though he had stripped away all of my carefully constructed defenses. I could have changed the topic and left it at that, but Ben and I were the last people at the office finishing a lengthy project one of those evenings when I started to look forward to it more than I should have. I was organizing some last files and reviewing details I had already memorized in order to extend the time he had with me. Something made me pause and make me meet his gaze. "I don't know," I said quietly, and as the words left my lips, I felt like I'd crossed a line when I couldn't come back from Ben. He simply nodded, his eyes lingering on mine, and I knew he understood exactly what I meant. The words hung in the air as I looked over that familiar half-smile on his lips and said, "Let me give you a ride. It's late, and it's not like anyone is waiting for me at home." I told myself that it was just a ride and that it wasn't a big deal because I was married and we were co-workers and friends, but even as I accepted it, I knew that something was changing between us that night. The silence in the car was both reassuring and charged, the city lights rushing past us, their glow reflected off the windows. When we pulled up in front of my house, I was unsure whether to thank him and go or invite him inside. It was more instinctive than conscious. I heard myself ask, "Do you want to come in for a drink?" My voice sounded casual, maybe a little too casual, like I was talking to an old friend. He looked at me, and for a moment I could tell he was thinking about what this meant too, but then he nodded, shutting. In addition, his profile felt both familiar and dangerously new. Off the car, and accompanied me up the stairs to the door. The house was as quiet as usual, but with the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock in the hallway, everything felt heightened. I poured us each a glass of wine in the hopes that it would help me relax. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, close enough to feel each other's presence, but far enough away that it felt safe. We discussed everything that was going on between us, including our jobs, our childhoods, his travels, and the cities I had always wanted to see, but never had, and every laugh. His hand barely touched mine, and I laughed, but my laughter was too soft and breathy, and I could see his gaze darken in response. He leaned in, and I knew what was coming, my heart pounding in my head with a mix of warning bells and this undeniable pull I'd been fighting for so long. He paused, his face so close I could feel his breath, waiting for some sign from me. All I had to do was move away. With every shared look, the tension grew, curling between us like smoke, something elusive but tangible. I leaned in, and his lips met mine gently at first, as if he were giving me one last chance to back away, but I didn't want to. The kiss deepened slowly and intoxicatingly, drawing me under, and I could feel the spark that I'd been missing for so long coursing through me, flooding me with something I hadn't felt in years. Every touch and every murmur took me farther away from the life I'd known and into something I couldn't resist. It was an exhilarating and terrifying experience, like being at the edge of a cliff. The affair started that night. He chose to jump off a cliff, and we parted ways without saying anything or making any promises. I stood there by myself, the taste of his kiss still on my lips, and the house was silent around me as if it were a witness to everything I had just done. As I went upstairs, guilt crept in, the weight of my decisions pressing down on me. I knew this was wrong. I knew I was breaking something sacred, but the rush of it, the way it made me feel alive again, was something I couldn't escape. The rest of my life faded into the background, each day becoming just another wait for the moments I could be with him. As the weeks went by, my world split in two. He saw the beautiful wife who came home from work too exhausted to do much, and he saw the version of me that Carl saw, who slipped into a rhythm that felt both thrilling and inevitable. We would meet after work and find moments to steal away to share glances that carried hidden meanings. More than a quick chat. And then there was the version of me that came to life with Ben. Driven by this reckless, unquenchable fire, I couldn't stop the excitement of it all. It felt like my life had color again, as if I'd been living in black and white for years, and then someone at home turned the dial to full saturation. The gap between Carl and me widened every day, but he hardly seemed to notice, which I believe hurt most of all. He would look up from the couch when I entered, giving me the same fleeting smile. Carl was stuck in his routine as if he hadn't really looked at me in years. I knew the affair was wrong and that every moment I spent with Ben was a betrayal I could never take back, but Ben made me feel like the woman I wanted to be. If he said something about how busy I was working late or asked if I'd eaten anything, he never questioned it or showed even the slightest hint of suspicion. His complete trust in me felt like a blessing and a burden. Every time I was with him, I felt a spark of vitality that I had never realized I was lacking. It was addictive, like a drug I had never tried before, and every encounter left me wanting more. Our meetings increased in frequency, and our conversations shifted from work projects to whispered confessions and plans for future rendezvous. We developed a language of glances and touches, the smallest movements carrying meaning that only we understood. Carl started to notice the changes, but in his quiet, unassuming way, he would ask if I was okay, if work was wearing me down. I would laugh it off and tell him that things were just busy and that I'd be back to myself soon, but the truth was that I didn't know who I was anymore. Meetings would cause my heart to skip, he would smile, and my stomach to flip. It was both thrilling and terrifying to know that I'd let myself fall so completely, but the tension was beginning to spill over into my marriage. One night, when I came home, I found him waiting in the kitchen. It was one of the few times he wasn't glued to the TV, and he looked up at me with a worried expression that nearly tore through my armor. "You're always so tired lately," he said in a soft voice, but I was prompted to ask if everything was okay. My first thought was to dismiss it by saying that work was demanding and that I had just been under pressure with a big project, but the concern in his eyes was a faint trace of the man who used to know. I wanted to tell him everything, to confess the truth, to show him how unhappy I'd been to let him share in the weight of what I was carrying, but I couldn't. Instead, I gave him a comforting smile and a quick kiss on the cheek, but he sighed, a sound that was barely audible but filled with a heaviness that spoke louder than words, as I walked up the stairs to our bedroom. I felt a pang of guilt that was sharp and stinging for a moment. With Carl, I found everything I'd been missing. We'd spend hours together discussing our plans and dreams, places we wanted to see, and things we wanted to do. He made me feel vibrant and alive, as if I were a part of something extraordinary. Every touch and stolen kiss felt like fuel keeping me going. I could feel his gaze following me, full of questions he didn't know how to ask. I wanted to feel something: anger, sadness, remorse, or rage, but instead I felt numb, pulling me farther away from the life I had built with Carl, and every time I left him, I experienced a wave of guilt so strong that it almost broke me. But the next day, Ben's attention would take over and I would find myself back at his side, caught in a vicious cycle I couldn't break. Then, one evening as I was getting ready to leave work, Carl called out of the blue. He didn't often call me at work, and the sound of his soft, familiar voice startled me. "I thought I'd stop by the office, maybe take you out to dinner," he said, trying to sound casual. I couldn't recall the last time we did that, and the suggestion was so unexpected and different from him that I nearly freaked out. I tried to explain that I had already eaten with some coworkers and that it was just another late night, but I could hear the hurt in his voice and the faint crack as he tried to hide his disappointment. It served as a reminder of how far I'd come and how much I was willing to risk for a few hours of excitement, but he seemed more distant than ever as I lay in bed next to him that night. Ben was my escape, my salvation, the answer to everything I thought I'd lost, and as wrong as it was, as much as I knew it was tearing apart my marriage, I couldn't let go. It was a Friday night, and Carl was supposed to be out of town for a work conference, but he had left 2 days earlier. His breathing was steady, but his body was rigid, like he was lying next to a stranger. I wanted to reach out and touch his shoulder to somehow bridge the gap that had grown between us, but my hand fell back, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling more alone than ever. Ben was the center of my universe in my new reality, where we met at his place or occasionally after work. That night, though, he came over to my house, something we had been careful to avoid until then. With Carl gone, I was able to relax and let my guard down in a way I hadn't in months because I wanted to feel free, even for just one night. We started with a drink to take the edge off, and I remember that we laughed a lot, probably more than we should have, and that our voices drifted freely through the silence. It felt like we were in our own world, free from the problems of my marriage and the consequences I had been avoiding for so long. I felt at peace and like I was living a different life for the first time in a long time. We spoke for hours, the conversation fading into an awkward but charged silence. Ben leaned in and kissed me, and I didn't resist. I melted into it and felt that familiar thrill, the sense that I belonged, even if only for a brief moment. Then, as his hand moved to my shoulder, I initially froze when I heard the distinct sound of the front door opening, but as footsteps reverberated down the hallway, my blood turned to ice. Carl wasn't supposed to be home until Sunday, so I withdrew from Ben, my heart racing, but it was too late. Carl was standing in the doorway, his suitcase still in hand, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and confusion that quickly turned to rage. The silence was oppressive, with each second passing as Carl's gaze shifted from me to Ben, piecing together the unspoken truth. He dropped the suitcase, his jaw clenched, and his face turned a shade of red I had never seen before. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words died before I could finish. I was left feeling like I was a stranger in my own skin. "What the hell is this?" Ben's voice was low, shaking, and his fury was barely contained. He made a mumbled statement about leaving, but Carl blocked the doorway by taking a step forward, his fists clenched, his expression a storm of hurt. Ben's eyes darted to me, pleading, but I was paralyzed, trapped in this nightmare I had brought upon myself. Carl moved closer, his hand reaching out not to me but to Ben, and without hesitation or warning, he grabbed Ben by the collar, pushing him back against the wall with a force I hadn't known Carl possessed. A fight broke out quickly and brutally, the air heavy with the sounds of fists and labored breathing. I screamed, reaching out, but neither of them heard me. They were locked in their own war, a battle I started, and all I could do was watch as everything fell apart. Then, with a final shove, Ben managed to push Carl back, wiping blood from his lip, his face pale. Breathing, Carl swung repeatedly, his anger spilling out in every blow, a torrent of years of neglect, resentment, and heartbreak. Ben tried to push him off, but Carl was unrelenting, his movements clumsy and desperate. And shuddering, "I'm going," he muttered, but Carl lunged once more, refusing to let him go. They struggled, slamming into the walls and the furniture with each slam, and at last they broke apart, both of them breathing heavily, their faces bloodied and bruised. Carl turned to face me, his face showing pure devastation, his voice ragged, hardly more than a whisper. "Why, Laura? Why would you do this?" I felt the weight of his words bear down on me, destroying any remaining rationalization or self-deception. I tried to respond by saying something that would make sense of the decisions I had made, but I was unable to do so because I had nothing that would make his eyes stop hurting or reverse what I had done. Finally, his voice became cold and detached, and he said, "Get out of my house, both of you." The finality of his words broke my heart. I reached out to touch him, hoping to provide some consolation, but he returned his face with a mask of anguish and disgust. There was no turning back, no way to fix this. Ben grabbed his jacket. He nodded slightly, saying goodbye in a silent manner, and slipped away into the night, leaving me alone in the ruins of my marriage. I could only watch as Carl turned his back on me and retreated into the darkness of our bedroom, sinking to the floor with the weight of my decisions overwhelming me and suffocating me. The house, which had once been warm and familiar, was now a stranger, as empty and broken as the vows I had broken. Carl's presence was a ghostly reminder of what we'd lost, and every quiet moment between us was heavy with the weight of words left unsaid. I tried to speak to him to offer some explanation or apology, but he wouldn't look at me. He moved around the house like a stranger, staying in the spare bedroom and avoiding me with a focus that cut deeper than any words could. In the days that followed that night, the silence in the house became unbearable as I felt the full measure of my guilt and the terrible reality of what I had lost forever. I didn't hear much from Ben after that night. At first, he sent a few messages expressing vague apologies and making an effort to discuss what had happened, but with each exchange, the excitement we'd shared felt thinner, like the fading echo of something that was never meant to last. It was painfully obvious that I had turned my life upside down for a connection that had been nothing more than an escape, and all those moments that had once felt like salvation now felt like a lie, as empty. The hurt in his eyes haunted me and served as a constant reminder of the harm I'd caused. I tried to continue to focus on my work and routines, anything that could anchor me in a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else, but everything reminded me of what I'd lost. Little things, everyday objects that had once been insignificant now heavy with meaning, the cup Carl had always used, and the promises we'd made to each other, and eventually Ben faded from my life entirely, slipping into silence, as if he'd never been there at all. Every memory I had of the life I'd betrayed, from the way he used to hum while making coffee to the old pictures hidden in drawers we'd forgotten to open, haunted me like a stone pressing down on me. I would catch myself reaching for my phone to message Carl to check in and talk about something that had happened during the day, only to realize that there was nothing left to share. I wished desperately that I could go back in time and undo what I'd done, but time passed relentlessly, forcing me to live. A man who had lost everything he believed he could trust was sitting at the kitchen table staring out the window one evening when I finally plucked up the courage to approach him. I sat across from him, my hands shaking, my heart pounding, trying to find the right words to get through to him so he would understand, but he looked at me with a kind of resignation I had never seen before, a hollow acceptance that sliced through me. "Carl," I whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. "I am so sorry. I know there's nothing I can say to make it right, but I want you to know how much I regret what I did." I'm not sure why my voice broke under the weight of my confession, or how I lost sight of what we had. I just want a chance to make things right for a moment. He didn't say anything. His eyes were fixed on the table, and his expression was unreadable. When he did look at me, there was a quiet acceptance that made my heart hurt. "Laura," he said in a steady but gentle voice. "Ever since it happened, I've tried to understand how we came to understand what had gone wrong, and what I could have done differently. He stopped, his eyes meeting mine with a finality that made it impossible to argue. But the truth is that after what you did, I don't think I can ever trust you again, and I don't think I can put that faith back together. His words struck me like a physical blow, and I felt the tears fall. I wanted to beg for one more chance, but I knew deep down that he had already made up his mind. Carl took a deep breath. I can't forget, and I can't live like this knowing what's happened between us. He continued, his voice barely more than a whisper, clenching onto the table with his gaze distant. Maybe one day I'll be able to forgive you, he said, but I can't forget and I can't live like this knowing what's happened between us. He looked away, a single tear slipping down his cheek, and my heart broke as I watched him. I need to go, he said, finally. I need to find a way to move on staying here. It just reminds me of everything we lost. I reached out, my hand shaking. In the days that followed, Carl moved out, leaving our house cold and empty, stripped of the warmth and laughter it had once held. I watched him pack his belongings, the silence between us thick with the finality of saying goodbye. He didn't say much, just a few quiet words as he gathered his belongings, each item a reminder of the life we'd built together and the life I'd thrown away. I wanted to touch him one last time, but he pulled back his face, filled with the raw pain of someone who had loved and lost everything. As the days turned into weeks, I attempted to put my life back together and find some semblance of normalcy in the midst of the emptiness, but every moment was tinged with regret and the crushing realization that the excitement and thrill that had once seemed so real with Ben had now felt hollow, a fleeting illusion that had vanished the moment Carl walked out the door. All I had left was my own guilt and the pain of knowing that I had destroyed the one thing I'd always thought would last. As I stood in the empty house, the echoes of my past reverberating around me, I realized that I had no one to blame but myself. I had reached out to Carl a few times in the hopes that perhaps one day he would forgive me and that there might still be a way to heal, but each time he kept his distance because his heart was too broken and his trust too shattered to allow me back in. Seemed so significant, but now felt pointless and served only as a diversion from my own misery. In the quiet that had been our home, all that remained was the memory of what we had lost, and the realization that I had destroyed the one thing I didn't know I needed until it was gone, and my quest for something more was more painful than any regret.